Hello, everybody. There, how's everybody doing? Hello, Irene, Libby. Good to see you. When I'm looking off to the left here, I'm looking at the chat field here. So it's great to see you all. If anybody's new here, my name's Scott. I work with Artist Network. Yeah, feel free to shout out where you're coming from. I'm kind of, like I said, I'm watching the comment kind of thread happening off to my left here. So give a shout out where you're from, what you're working on. If any of you happen to work on the previous drawing, I'd love to hear some thoughts about how that went. Any questions that may be coming out from that as well. Today I am working on this. Life gave us lemons, so we as artists make art, not lemonade. You'll find the reference photo in the description, so feel free to bring that up to your light. Just a window in another room that happened to come in. This is my kitchen counter here. I think natural light from coming in from a window is really an optimal lighting source for setting up a still life. What I really like about this setup here is that we have this alternating sequence of lights and darks, and I've talked about this in other of the live drawing exercises here. And so we have, it's a relatively white surface, but in the photograph it's coming off as gray, and especially in the context of these highlights, you can see how dark that actually is. But we have this alternating sequence of dark to light. This gets a little bit darker, darker even still, and then we have these patches of light, dark, etc. So when we're looking at those value relationships, we're alternating between those lights and darks, and I'm finding that really effective for helping to create a sense of form and volume out of these objects. One of the reasons I like to cut something like this, a lemon, in half, and I'll do this with, any really vegetable or fruit, etc. I really like to do this is that, especially with a pairing like this, where you have the whole lemon and then the partial lemon, you just get more information about the object. And not only just the physical information about what the object is and its various materials, but also it's just from a formal perspective, what the structure is. So I can really see the volume of that lemon by cutting it in half like that, or it's not quite in half, but very similar to what we did with bananas. Last week we used the tape to kind of achieve that same effect. This provides some of that cross-contour information about the structure of that lemon. So hopefully that makes sense. You'll see also in the product description, or the video description, that I'm working on tone paper, just like I did in the last one. I chose to do that partly because of that additional challenge that it poses to me. We're building by laying down the darks. We're also building by laying down the light. So we're letting the middle gray of the paper help us get to a certain amount of value control. So if I'm working with white paper, it's a purely additive process. I'm always adding charcoal on there, and I'm subtracting down by erasing. But in this case, with the highlights, when I want to get to the light, I actually need to add into it. So the highlights are really an additive process as well. So I like that challenge. I'm also going to play around with blending the white chalk that I have with the charcoal to create some variation in this area here. So again, I've got my ebony pencil. I really like using this as a layout tool, using it on the side so I'm not embossing on the paper, so I'm not using the point of the tip here. I'm just kind of scraping it across the side, letting the weight of the pencil make the marks that I need. And you can see that I've already started to think through the composition and the overall proportions. So I'm just going to kind of work that out a little bit more, maybe kind of calling out some of the areas that I'm most interested in. Before I get too far, though, I want to say hello to everybody. We've got a lot of people calling in. I see some familiar names. Horst, I see Diane from Boston, Ann from North Texas. I see somebody from Colorado. Hello, hello. Cape Town, excellent. People coming from all over. I know today it's a beautiful day here in Colorado. I am hoping to get out for a little walk while I can. Hopefully it's not too bad where you're at, and you can get some nice fresh air. What I'm doing out here now is that I've got the basic structure laid out. I'm not refining the shape of this opening. I want to think about what that really is. It's not quite a perfect circle. It kind of levels out in some areas. And if you remember from some of the previous drawings that we've done, we've looked at breaking down these circular and elliptical forms into a sequence of straight edges and then connecting them. So I'm kind of looking at that as well and starting to connect these forms together, starting to gauge the distance between the kind of the opening of this lemon and that back edge. One of the things that's really kind of nice about this one versus the last one I did with a pipe is that this form is a bit more forgiving. If I'm off by a little bit, as long as it reads like a lemon, I'm going to be happy. With the previous one, with a pipe, if I'm off, it makes the pipe itself look wonky, and I want to try to avoid that. But in this case, I want to get kind of close, but I am going to choose to not be too persnickety if I'm off with the proportions, as long as I'm capturing the overall essence of that lemon. Here in the shadow area, there's some form going on in here, so I want to start to think through that as well. It's all going to get lost as I build in those overall shadow shapes, so I'm not going to worry too much about rendering that, but I want to think through that as I get going. Again, as I'm making my marks, I'm always trying to be aware of where these marks are in relationship to everything else. And that's something you get really good at as you practice drawing, is splitting your attention. So if I stay super focused on just this one part, and I move to the next part, and then I move to the next part, there's a chance that it's not all going to connect. So you have to be able to really wrap your head around both what's happening in a very small scale in your drawing, so maybe in this one spot, but also where that is in relationship to everything else. And so your mind is constantly moving in and focusing on an area and pulling back and seeing it as a whole. This is really a gesture drawing that I'm creating, and that's the power of gesture drawing, is you're looking at the form and how it fills in, the space and how it moves across the paper. And it's about capturing that overall essence, the whole of it, before you get into the details. And so, again, drawing is about allowing the image to emerge on the page. And if you're kind of new to this series, you'll have not have heard me say that at this point. If you've been following along, this is repetition for you. But again, for me, when I think about the word draw, I like to think about it as referring to pulling. We're actually drawing together here. We're actually pulling things together. You draw water from a well, draw names from a hat. You're pulling things out, and that's what we're doing on this paper here. So I'm thinking about where the drawing is and allowing that to emerge on the paper. So that starts by thinking about the big forms and then gradually moving into the finer ones. One of the things I want to lock my head around is the thickness of this white part of the lemon. And I don't know how specific I want to be with those details at this point. I just want to kind of block in that overall shape and place the center properly. If I place that incorrectly, it's going to change the perspective of that. So we want to think about this as really kind of being the central axis for the lemon. And if I move this down, it's going to change that axis. So getting that right is going to be essential in this drawing. In another drawing, it may be less critical in another subject. I'm going to squint a little bit. I'm using the screen in front of me, that right below the camera here, as a guide. It helps me to visualize what it looks like as I step back. It simulates what I would be seeing if I was looking at a distance. Got more people from, we got Austria. Hello again. All right, I'm seeing a lot of familiar names. Holland, Georgia, Holland, Michigan, it looks like, huh? The Big Island, it sounds like a nice place to be right now. Fellow from California. All right, I'm feeling pretty good about this form. The rest I'm going to try to resolve as I start to build up values. So if you've watched some of the previous drawings, I've started by using this vine charcoal to help think my way through the value shapes. And again, in this case, I want to start to think about where those lights are going to be. So the highlight here off the lemon, this light over here, and then it transitions into the shadow. So I want to start to think about the overall shadow shapes here. And as you may have seen me do in some of the previous drawing exercises here, this is a very soft and wispy material. This is a very soft vine charcoal. I love the way it moves across this toned paper. There's kind of a really interesting form that's happening with this shadow that I want to keep in my mind as I go. That shadow has a bit of a curve as it wraps around the cross contour of that lemon, but there's also an angle to it. And so getting this curve of the angle, trying to see, if anybody remembers, one of the terms I've used previously is the line of termination. So that line of termination is the point on the object where it transitions from light into shadow. That light terminates, and now it's all in the shadow area. That line is often very subtle and soft, but if you squint your eyes, you can start to define it a little bit more. Here in this, it's much more difficult, in part because of the texture of the lemon. It's kind of diffusing that shadow, it's diffusing the highlights a bit as well. So really understanding what that line of termination is going to be a challenge. And so I may have to take a few different stabs at it. Going to block in the basic shape of that shadow here. Going to block in the shape of the shadow as it crosses over the lemon behind there. And that's something that I staged intentionally when I set up the still life, is I wanted that shadow to cast onto the face of this lemon. Again, it gives me a bit more information, something more to sink my teeth into. Visually, it's interesting because it creates the alternating pattern of light and dark, but also structurally, it just gives me more to work with. And that's a lot of what we think about as artists when you're drawing or you're painting and you're setting up an object, or if you're working on a portrait. You want to think about, what are you able to see and what information are you able to glean from the setup that you've got. The better you understand the subject, the better your work is going to turn out. And it's kind of this feedback loop. As we draw, we become more familiar with it. The more familiar with it, the better our drawing, and you keep working your way across the drawing. Just using the vine charcoal on its side to help build up some value here. Let that be soft. I think what I'm going to do is artificially darken this, perhaps a bit darker than what we have in the reference photo. I'm really trying to let the weight of the charcoal do its thing here. I'm not pressing down very hard at all. There's just a tooth to the paper that will grab that charcoal. You see, I'm letting things become really kind of soft and atmospheric, using the kind of the pad of my hand to smooth things out rather than my fingertips. It allows me to continue to hold my charcoal, and it also keeps the oils from my fingers from messing with the paper. It's getting pretty lost here. So I think this is really going to, at some point, illustrate what I was talking about in terms of bringing out the drawing, allowing that image to emerge. Because right now I'm really losing that form. I can subtly see my lines, but I'll have to kind of address those a little bit later. And if anything, I might artificially kind of darken this area here adjacent to the highlight. Right here, that highlight's going to be. Let me see if I can define that form a little bit more using my kneaded eraser. And so now what I really need to be careful of is, as I'm drawing, my mind is really wanting this paper to feel like white. I'm kind of calibrating everything to the idea that this paper is white when it's not. And I really need to be thinking about middle value and trusting that those highlights in here are going to really help to define that form. So there's some strategic thinking that needs to happen, and trusting that these values are all going to work out. Maybe darken in here just a little bit. All right, take some time. We got people from Texas. Hello, Diane. From Shirley from Boise. Hello there, Jam. Hello from France and Vermont. We've got Nancy, Thomas from Arizona, and Rachel and her son Britton are following along here in Colorado. Hope you're doing well, Britton. All right. If you're working with just pencil, some graphite pencil, do the best you can. Just have fun with this process. Again, one of the things that I've I always like to kind of keep in my mind is that it's about drawing, not just the drawing. The drawing that we end up with is a record of the act of drawing that we've kind of committed to over this time. And so, if it's in my philosophy that if the experience of drawing isn't fun, if I haven't had a good time doing it, it's going to show in my work. And ultimately, it's about the time we're spending drawing is to me more valuable than the object itself. I can always create another drawing, but this is the only time that I get to do this with you all here. So, all right, just thinking through these values. I know that this fine charcoal is very subtle and soft at this point, and I'm going to be losing this. So this is really more about thinking for me, not accurately rendering any values at this point. I'm just trying to wrap my head around the basic shapes that I'm seeing and where I'm going to need to be building values throughout the object. Like in this area, for example, I'm looking at this and it's going to be a challenge because it's in shadow, and then within that we have these variations where we have this object in here that we know to be white. Our brain is saying that's white, but it's in shadow. And as for our brain to understand that that's a white object in shadow, I have to interpret that gray effectively and look at the contrast between these values. So much of what we do when we're drawing is really considering there's the optical truth, there's the way the object looks to us, and then there's the physical truth. There's what is happening, what is the object in front of us. And we're constantly kind of confronting those two things. And sometimes the optical truth is just really hard to understand. We have a hard time really kind of wrapping our heads around what's happening all optically, just like in these white areas. Again, my brain says that's white, but it's in shadow, so I need to figure out what that value is. How do I make a value that reads as white, although in shadow? So hopefully that makes sense. Hello, Anna from Colombia. Sawyer! Is that you, buddy? Good friend of mine from here in Colorado. Hope you're drawing along. And it's my sister, Amy, joining in from Maine, back in the home state. All right. She should be practicing the piano right now, but instead she's dropping everything in her life to watch me draw. I know that's exactly what's happening. All right, I'm feeling confident about this shape. And you may be looking at this and saying that looks like a hazy mess, which it is. But I'm feeling confident in my mind that I know what's happening here. Wow, what's kind of cool is you can see my thumbprint here, or my fingerprint, that's kind of catching some of the oils of my fingers there. Not that I'm all that worried about that. I'm erasing out some of these highlights. Again, I need to be kind of anticipating what those final values are going to be, kind of cleaning up this area here, doing some negative drawing. So if you see that initially I had a line along this edge, that's gone now. I used such a light line that it's being kind of consumed by the value of the charcoal. And so now I'm going to create that edge not by using a line, not using my pencil, but using my eraser to create that negative edge. And that's ultimately going to add to the realism in the drawing overall. All right, I'm feeling good about that. Maybe kind of pulling out some of this because I think I'm going to have to attack that later. I need more permanent marks now, so I'm going to grab, I've got another 2B. I've got two 2B pencils. You can see I started this whole series using this pencil, and just by working on it on these few drawings, you see that that's kind of worn away, the label. So I'm assuming it's a 2B, but that's going to happen. And I try not to get too fussy about the specific number on the pencil. If I'm using graphite, if I'm using charcoal, test it out, see how it feels. I've said this before, good materials can go a long way. At the same time, if you find yourself in a position where you can be drawing and you don't have your good materials, don't let that ever stop you. I mean, I've created a lot of drawings with just a yellow number 2. It's so easy to carry around with you. It's a very versatile tool. In this case, I have the ability to use some better materials here, get the materials that I want. But I would hate for somebody to be in a position where they're inspired to draw, they're really kind of motivated to build their skills, don't have the right materials, the right materials. If you've got a number 2 pencil, if you've got a ballpoint pen, grab it and go. There's so much you can learn from that. All right, so what you can see along here is that I'm trying to pay attention to the line work. I'm kind of building, establishing it, so that gives me some sort of guide, but I want to avoid a hard line along in here. And the reason I want to avoid that is I really want to create that rounded quality. I want that to wrap around back into space. So if anything, I'm going to make that feel more atmospheric. And I want to have a harder line in the foreground, in the front of this lemon, to help pop that forward. So in some cases, again, it's kind of up to you when you're drawing. How much do you want to kind of push your tools to get the objects to do what you want them to, and how much do you want to be kind of guided by the object? How much do you really want it to look like the object, exactly what you're looking at? Sometimes you need to fudge things. So for example, I'll probably darken this area artificially, just to create heightened contrast in this area, just like I may darken this area to create contrast against that. So kind of like a photographer has tools available to manipulate a photograph beyond the truth to create a better understanding of the object in a more dramatic image. We have those tools available to us as artists. You get to make those choices. You see a lot of artists that sacrifice optical truth. They sacrifice the desire and the ability to make it look exactly like it is. They sacrifice that in order to heighten the emotional impact, emotional connection to the drawing. So you want to determine for yourself what that balance looks like. All right, just kind of laying down charcoal. I'm going to go back in there and smooth that out a little bit. I'm going to darken this area. Thinking about the plane. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to block this whole value in. And as I was talking earlier about that white part of the lemon, part of the inner part of the rind there, I'm going to erase that back out with my kneaded eraser to help establish that, rather than kind of fuss with it at this point. Using my pinky here as a kind of a stabilizer. This is called an overhand grip. So I'm kind of pinching it between these 3 fingers here, using my pinky as a support, and just allowing the paper, the pencil to move across the paper. Start to build up these values. When I squint, these 2 values really kind of blend together. So I'm going to let that happen on my drawing as well, and I can create some greater contrast later. Kind of pushing my way through along this edge. Again, thinking of it as a series of short straight marks that accumulate together to create that curve. We'll see what do we have here. Hello, Carolyn. I'm glad hearing some positive responses here. If there's anything that I'm not articulating clearly, just let me know. Let me see, who else we have here. Tone paper has too much texture. Yeah, and is that the texture itself of the paper, or is it the surface underneath it? That's something that I never really considered before. This is a pretty smooth textured paper. But in some of the other drawings that I've done here, the surface that I've had really transfers through it. So just something to kind of think about as well. I know there's a lot of different kind of tooths to paper. And if you're thinking to yourself, paper is paper, there's so much more to it, and you want to find what works for you. So it sounds like Charles there, looks like you have a I have a learning experience there for you about the paper. I love to work. I'm going to see if I can get myself some cotton rag paper for one of these drawings here and show you kind of the difference of that. It's been a long time since I've worked with it. I'm going to try to build up these values, but that cotton rag paper is really kind of heavy duty, and when you erase into it, it'll actually start to peel off the upper layers, so you can get down to a brighter white a bit more effectively than some other papers. Each paper really is designed for a specific purpose. If you draw on watercolor paper, for example, you're going to see that it holds the pencil and the graphite or the charcoal in a unique way, and sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't. If you're working on charcoal paper specifically versus sketching paper, is going to grab the materials in a different way. There's a lot that goes into it. So just kind of think about what works for you and go with it. Let's see what else we've got. We've got Becky from Pennsylvania. Bill Creevy. I'll have to check out Bill Creevy, doing some interesting things with ballpoint pen. Yeah. I've it's been a while since I've worked with ballpoint pen, but just like I was saying earlier, if that's all you got, go for it. And some people, one of the artists that we worked with, Gigi Chen, she does some amazing things with ballpoint pen as well. Start to build up these values, and as you notice, I'm really just using the side of my pencil here to lay down these values. They're not correct. I'm thinking about the overall shadow shapes. Squinting my eyes. And I'm going to define the edges a bit more. This is all very soft. It's part of that thought process of allowing the image to emerge on the page. Wipe that down, soften that up. All right, erase out that edge again. Starting to see that light effect taking place here, even though I'm still at a fairly light gray here with the tone of the paper. All right, let's see, what do we want to do? I think I'm going to work on refining this more distant lemon. That way I can kind of place this back here and put this other one right on top of it. I could do this one and then try to move into the one next to it. I run the risk of creating kind of a halo, and I talked about that before. That's something that bugs me, but it's also kind of a personal preference on how you work. Some people are really good at avoiding that or working with it. It just doesn't really work for me. So I'm going to start by doing this lemon, and if anything, I'm going to go right over the edge of this one. Because I know this is going to be dark, I'm not worried about marks here crossing over because I can always come back in on top with a darker mark to pop that forward. All right. Here's what I think I'm going to do. I need to erase out this center point just to create some of that contrast. All right, I am going to rely on my smudging stick here to kind of create some texture. And it's already got charcoal built up on it from previous drawings. So as I kind of smooth this out, I'm not grinding down, I'm just letting it scrape across the surface as well. Part of what I'm doing though is I'm rolling it between my fingers, and I'm just picking up charcoal on this. All right, and so what I may end up having to do is define this edge a little bit more with some negative drawing. Feather that out a little bit so it doesn't become kind of a reverse halo there. All right. So now that I've got some charcoal on the tip here, I'm going to start kind of laying down some texture in here. And I'm just kind of rolling that between my fingers, and I'm thinking about the basic structure of the interior of this lemon. So I'm always kind of aware of the central point here and the fact that in general everything's radiating out from that. So I don't necessarily need to get every kind of detail and mark correct in this. I just want to really suggest that value. And you can see that I'm just creating these abstract kind of marks based on my impression of the shapes that are there, letting the tool itself do the work. So rather than drawing in a shape and then filling it in, I'm letting the natural kind of tendency of this shading stump to kind of do its thing to create these kind of marks that actually start to replicate and reference the interior of that lemon. Just need to pick up some more charcoal. Start to think about where it's getting darker. Kind of pushing and pulling as I go. So in my mind, if I get it close, I'm good. I don't necessarily have to be 100% accurate. Now I've reached the point where I need to add some darker values in here. Let me build this up. I'm going to use a similar kind of thought process, but with the charcoal. Again, just I'm not using the point to draw these shapes. I'm using the side of it, and I'm going to create some kind of abstract marks that kind of replicate or reference the texture of the interior of the lemon there. Kind of trying to be mindful of that inner part of the rind there, that soft part, working my way up to it. And now you can see that just by adding the dark next to it, it's starting to create some kind of negative drawing where that form is appearing. So I'm not actually drawing this part, it's appearing by me working on the area around it. Build up some values. I'm just kind of letting the natural tooth of the paper assist me a little bit by creating some additional value. One of the things I'm observing as I go along here is that right now I'm not concerned about that edge along here, that specific shape. That edge is a lost and found edge. Some areas it's more clear and crisp, and I can let my drawing reflect that. And then in other areas, it almost disappears, kind of like right up in this area here. And again, I want my drawing to reflect that lost and found quality. And then from that, our mind starts to fill in the rest. So if any of you are oil painters or acrylic painters and you happen to work with your palette knife, I'm thinking very much like I do when I'm working with a palette knife here, when I'm using the side of my charcoal. All right, starting to build that up. Let me smooth this out. Constantly moving my eyes back and forth from the reference photo to the drawing. Squinting is a mighty tool, so use it. You're going to get yourself into more trouble if you focus too much on the details. I would say about 90% of the drawing process for me is done with my eyes out of focus. Add this little crack in there. I need to define some of these forms here. So we got to kind of have an interior lost and found edge, where the central part of the lemon is kind of sharper in some areas, more diffused in others. How do we feel about that? It's starting to come together. And if I need to, I'm going to erase out this form a little bit, kind of clean this up. I'm going to use that white chalk later to help really bring this form to life. But I'm feeling pretty good about it now. I'm going to darken this area here so you can see that, one of the things I talked about earlier is perhaps using my eraser to pull that value back out. I hadn't gone dark enough. It felt darker than it actually was, but once I start to get other darks in around it, I realized that actually that's probably the right value. And in order to create the impression of that white there, I just needed to darken the areas around it. All right. I apologize if it seems like I'm glaring at you when I look at the camera. I am not. I'm looking at the drawing in the screen. and I'm actually letting my eyes lose focus so I can see what those value relationships are. All right, who else? Life gives you lemon or textured paper. Yeah, that's right. Oh, and my daughter Taryn is back. I see that she's on there. It's good to see you in here, littles. Hope you're drawing along too. All right, a little bit of kind of texture here. There's some reflected light happening in the top here where the shadow becomes a bit more distinct. And then in some areas, and it gets a little bit lighter, and then we start to see it a bit more in there. All right, and let me see what happens if I kind of darken this, just use some kind of atmospheric lines back here, again, to artificially darken it. These marks are moving from left to right, so I'm kind of lifting off in this direction. I realize this all may be out of sync for you. The cameras aren't quite synchronized with their sound. All right, so darken that, squinting. And actually, I'm just going to leave that there because I could continue to fuss all day long on this. But I need to float around to another part. I'm going to move into the shadow. The shadow is a bit more forgiving. Work my way up. I want to think about where this cast shadow exits from behind the lemon there. I think it's somewhere right around here. All right, and so you notice with these cast shadows, sharper, crisper, darker at the base, at that point of contact between the object and the surface. That point of contact is actually hidden behind the curve of the lemon there. And so that's where it's going to actually be darkest. And the lemon kind of covers over it. It gets darker and sharper and more diffuse and lighter as you move away from it. And that's defined by the natural light source. You know, some artificial light sources are going to create different cast shadows. Some are going to be sharper, some are going to be more diffused. But it's something to kind of pay attention to is what the edges are doing, and ultimately what becomes most critical is really perceiving that change in the shadow, that cast shadow, as it moves from that point of contact to away from the object as it becomes more diffused. Running my marks horizontally to help reinforce the horizontal nature of the surface. I'm going to try to feather this out with my kneaded eraser. You know, if you've got too much texture on the paper, then I love you too, littles. If you have too much texture on the paper, you can use your kneaded eraser to kind of tap out some of those dark spots and then try smudging it back in. It can get a little tedious if it's really excessive, but if it's really bothering you, give that a shot. As long as you're not kind of beating yourself up, if you realize the paper is just not doing what you would want it to do, the paper is what it is. It's going to do what it does. Do your best to work with it. Maybe try out a different paper, kind of go on, because there's going to be some cases where that paper is going to be exactly right for you. So it's all information that you can use later on. So, all right. So I'm thinking about the cross contour. Again, if you're new here, you may not have heard in any of the other drawing exercises that concept of the cross contour. So the contour is the outer edge of the object. The cross contour is the information kind of inside of those edges that give us an understanding of that form. And let this kind of soften. I feel like I've overstated this reflected light under here. It's a little bit too bright. So I'm going to kind of blend these two together. I'm blending together the cast shadow and the form shadow. Hopefully everybody remembers what the form shadow is. If you're new, you may not have heard it, but if you're recurring, I've referred to that a few times now. Form shadow is the shadow on the form of the object. Cast shadow is the shadow that is cast by the object onto the surface. And then the shadow shape is a combination of those two. And you want to be able to see the shadow shape first, that overall shadow shape first, and then break that apart into the cast shadow and the form shadow. All right, what do we think here? It's coming together. All right, I'm going to move on to this one. So as you can see, this area is very kind of ambiguous at this point. I want to define it a bit more. So I'm going to look at that specific shape, and this lemon is darker here against the slightly lighter part of the lemon there. And if this is too dark, I can always tap that out with my kneaded eraser, so I'm not going to worry about that at this point yet. I want to get this dark value in first, evaluate it, just dragging my pencil along the paper at this point. So value is relative. It's always defined by the values around it, just like color. Color is relative. We never perceive a color in isolation. It's always in the context of the things around it. And our brains get very good at calibrating the values and the colors of objects based on what we're, based on the environment. So for example, if you're wearing a pair of sunglasses, it's going to, your eyes are going to calibrate. If they're tinted yellow, for example, everything initially is going to look yellow, but eventually your brain corrects that and calibrates it, because what's critical for the brain is not that now everything is yellow. Your brain is kind of thinking backwards, understanding that it's in now a yellow environment, and trying to understand what the actual values and colors are of the objects that you're looking at. And we're always doing that. See, that's why it's really important to always check your values and understand that you may feel like it's right when you first lay it down, but it's going to change once you affect the values around it. Now, if you're looking closely at the reference image, you're going to see some reflected light here, where the light is bouncing off of this lemon, back at this one, kind of glancing off the surface and up to our eye. For me to create that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to forget about that for now. I don't want to overstate it. I want to see that as being in shadow first, and then I'm going to use my eraser to pull that reflected light back out. If I overstate it, if I make that too strong, it's going to pop forward, it's going to flatten out the lemon, and I don't want that. I want this highlight to really be the star of the drawing. And so even though I'm observing that reflected light, I really want to get in there right now, because it's kind of a juicy part of the drawing is when you get those little details, and I'm trying to avoid that at this point. So, okay. All right, so I'm kind of seeing a form shadow here, and the light is coming at an angle. So there's almost like there's kind of crossing form shadows here, those lines of termination. So we got kind of this compound shape. I'm letting the natural tooth of the paper kind of work with me here. And I think that's going to serve me well in terms of replicating that that look of the texture there. I'm going to darken this, pop that out a little bit. All right, how am I feeling about this? Let's see. Anybody else? All right, hello. Everybody catching up, huh? All right. Oh yeah, there it is. I was looking for my shading stump, and it was in my hand. All right, so again, I just said I like the texture. I need to kind of soften a little bit. Really being subtle with the shading stuff right now. It's a very light touch on that surface, because I don't want to lose the tooth of the paper. But I do want to smudge it out a little bit. If you don't have one of these shading sticks, use the the side of your hand, you can see how dirty that is right there. I've been using that a lot. And that's why one of the reasons I like to pivot on my pinky is that it keeps this off the paper. But you can use that to kind of blend. Some people really dislike the feeling of charcoal on their hands, and I get it. If you don't like it, these shading sticks are really helpful, these tortillions. I don't know if I'm even saying that correctly, but if not, use a paper towel. Roll that up. Use whatever tool works for you. All right. I want to start to think through this form. So again, this has picked up a lot of charcoal now. So I'm going to use that to draw with a little bit. I'm trying to be subtle. I think what I need to do is change up my marks. Use these kind of smaller zigzaggy marks. Not trying to control it too much. And that edge is kind of getting lost. It's all right. I'll use my eraser to pull that back out. Just trying to simulate texture. So I'm using these little circles, figure eights, just kind of thinking through that texture. And I may have to revisit this a little bit more when I add the highlights on there, because that's going to really affect the overall value. Let me sharpen that back up a little bit. All right, how are we feeling looking at the reference here? Yeah, it's close enough, I think. All right, I want to get this cast shadow. Again, sharper, darker at the base. And there's an interesting shape to this shadow here. There's kind of a line that seems to cut across, where it gets a little bit darker as it cuts across both of these. There's obviously a light that comes through here in this kind of wedge. So I want to try to observe that, but I want to be careful not to overstate that. And there's a little bit of reflected light. You almost see like this orange glow down in this area that I want to capture as well. So as I darken this, maybe it's a little bit darker on this side here. So when I'm building up value like this, I want to be really careful with my back and forth marks here. If I'm not careful, I create dark marks at the end and dark marks at this end, kind of back and forth. And you can see how it starts to create these implied lines this way. So if anything, I want to create these marks with almost a rocking motion, where it's kind of heavier in the center of the stroke, and it helps prevent that. So it's kind of feathering out those hatch marks a bit, and it's going to make it easier to blend. So as I'm doing that, I can still even see them subtly, these marks that I laid down. It'll just be kind of a record of that part of the lesson there. I'm going to soften this up a little bit and kind of let that just kind of be soft there. In the reference photo, this really gets dark. One of the concerns I have about that in the drawing is just from a compositional point of view. If I darken this too much, I think it's going to weight it too heavily down that side. I want to keep the central focal point really kind of present there. I want to maintain high contrast in that center, and so I'm just going to let that. I'm going to let this kind of just soften here. All right, how am I feeling about that? I kind of felt like I overstated that line. I was not being very sensitive to that one, but that's all right. See what I can do to get rid of that. Maybe it's all right. Sometimes I wonder, it'd be interesting to count the number of marks we make in our drawings. It all happens so fast. Sharpen this. Let me smooth this out a little bit. I want to blend this in. And one of the things we talked about in a previous drawing exercise as well was, what happens is we're laying down this charcoal on textured paper, so that when it's scraping across the surface, it's allowing some of that white of the paper to show through, which affects our understanding of the overall value. That's optical mixing. From a distance, our eyes kind of blend those areas together, and sometimes we want to use that to our advantage, and sometimes it's not what we want. So that's what the smudging stick kind of does, is it kind of knocks that down a little bit. All right, let's see here. I'm going to erase this back out. It's already starting to create that light effect, and I haven't even gotten to building up the values from this gray here. Yeah, and once this is live, the video will stay up, and so you can go back to any of the previous ones. How many are we on now? This must be number 5, I think. And so you can go back and watch those as well. So it's going to stay up on YouTube, on the Artist Network YouTube page. And if you're looking for more information and additional drawing resources, if you go to artistnetwork.com, at the very top there's a link to the live drawing exercises. It says Drawing Together right there at the top. Check that out. I've got other courses that you might be interested in. Artist Network, we really feeling like this is a great time to provide kind of just whatever tools you need as an artist to grow. Taking the time to build your skills, just let your mind rest on something else like art. It can be really beneficial, and we value that. And so we're trying to do our best to provide additional resources there. So if you want to check that out, there's going to be more information. You can find links to all the previous drawings. And we're going to keep doing this every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So I hope you all continue to join in. Ooh, that was a little strong. Let's see what happens. I think we can fix it. Sometimes you can't, and that's all right. I'm going to build up some of these values here. Starting to think about those shapes there. Again, keeping these marks kind of light and loose. All right. I'm feeling pretty good about this area here. I might actually end up darkening this even farther. You can see these subtle shifts in value that start to reference a form. There's some light bouncing off of these surfaces into that shadow area, and that's what's helping to define that form. I want to be careful not to overstate it. So I'm going to look at those forms, and instead of erasing out the light, I'm just going to be building up the values around it. I don't know how I'm feeling about all this. Let's see. My brain is starting to lose that form. Actually, you know what might help is to darken in this spot right here at the stem. Give me something to anchor that on. Can let this area stay fairly subtle. And one of the things I mentioned earlier is that, I wanted to create these contrasts. If that's too dark, I can always lighten it up, but I wanted to make sure I got this value in first. And now I'm feeling, if anything, it's still a little bit too light. So that's really kind of an interesting effect. I'm going to darken in some of these areas. All right, okay. How are we feeling? Right now, the high contrast right against here is flattening things out. I want to bring in that shadow core right in here. This is going to be the darkest part of the lemon. Not right up against that edge where that line of termination is, not right against the outer edge where there's some bounce light, some reflected light. I'm going to make the shadow core, the darkest part of that shadow, it's going to exist right in here. And I'm always thinking about the form. So thinking about the cross contour, and rounding out my marks to create some of that cross contour. And I can also run marks, this way to show this form here and start to radiate out from the central axis of the lemon. And as we wrap around the form, as we get closer to the outer edges, those forms get closer and closer together as they wrap around there. So just kind of thinking about that overall form. All right, how are we feeling about that? Let's see, any questions so far? Anybody feeling kind of lost? That's something that was bothering me. This bounce light here, this is starting to feel too strong. Let me darken that up. And that'll really help to wrap that lemon underneath, tuck under into that cast shadow. Okay. Some areas that edge gets a little bit harder to really kind of define. Let your drawings reflect that. I don't have to necessarily complete this stretch along here. You can see where it just kind of disappears. Our brain fills that in. So again, if you've been present for some of the previous ones, that term that we used to describe that is that the Gestalt principle of the law of good continuation, that our eyes will continue the path of a sequence of marks and perceive a complete path even when it's broken. We'll continue that in our mind. Okay, feeling pretty good. All right, I feel good about this so far, so I'm going to start adding in some of that light. Now, the light white charcoal that I'm working with, the white chalk, is very cool. Charcoal tends to be warm. This is a fairly warm paper. When I mix this with the charcoal, it's going to create kind of a different tone, a different temperature that we're going to be able to perceive. And so we can use that to our advantage in some areas. So for example, if here in the shadow area, if I want to distinguish between those two, I can start to blend with this white chalk. So very subtly, I don't want to affect the value too much, but just try to blend those two together and use this as a transition into what will be the highlight up here. You can see I'm picking up some of that gray there, but I'm using that temperature shift to help define that edge. And if I need to, let me see if I maybe define this a little bit more. Get a little bit more contrast under here. And I can do that in this area here as I can start to render some of the interior lines here. Keep the marks light and loose. Don't have to overstate them. These lines, you can just kind of piece them together as a series of dots and dashes, and we'll be able to really understand what's going on. All right. I'm just going to use the side here, see if I can file that down. I may need to pull out my sandpaper. Give me that sharp point, clean that off a little bit. Set that over here. All right, here we go. I'm going to attack this lemon right now in the background. I'm just going to go for it. I want to be careful I don't want this to be pure white. If I go white but not super strong, I'll get the contrast I need, but it's also going to stay back there. We have the highlights coming in here, and I want that to pop forward. That's going to help me to create that illusion of depth of this lemon being in front of the one behind it, using that value control. And there's that thin strip along the lemon rind there. I want to be careful about the direction of my marks as I'm wrapping around this, and if I make these marks too heavy, that's really going to work against me in terms of creating depth. What I should be doing is actually this, is allowing these marks to radiate out from the center, just to, if anything, to reinforce the structure of the lemon in front of me. So I'm using the side of the pencil here because I want to preserve the tip for some of these really kind of spot highlights there. Now in this case, I'm not going to use the shading stump because that is all gummed up with charcoal. And I'm rolling my pencil as I go, kind of finding fresh chalk there. All right, now I'm going to kind of feather this out to create that transition between the light and the shadow. And thinking about in the photograph where that line tends to be, maybe a little bit lower. And we kind of catch some light right up here on that edge. So if I sharpen up this edge, that'll help pull that corner forward. I don't think corner is necessarily the right term, but it's the way I perceive it. It's that sharp edge on the corner of that cut. So by sharpening that, allowing these edges to stay soft and atmospheric will help to artificially create that sense of depth. Now I need to bring things into the center. What do we do here? Let's see. And then right in here, we have the central part that's kind of actually being bisected by that shadow as well. So I'm going to kind of sneak up on that. I don't want to overstate that. And it also has some structure to it. You see this little crack that comes in along there. There's a light rim along that edge, and then on this side is catching the light as well. So again, instead of creating a line that goes around, I am just creating that edge by connecting together a series of dots and dashes. How does that look? It feels like it catches the light pretty well. So I left this a little bit lighter, but not quite as bright as those highlights there, and that helps to create that form. And if I need to, I can kind of restate that kind of crack there to give us something to really rest our eyes on. That sharp focus in some areas could be helpful. Okay, now we have these highlights here. Now a trick you can use with your chalk there, and I just learned this. We filmed with a portrait artist named Nathaniel Skousen. He's a relatively young artist there, an excellent portrait painter, excellent portrait drawer. And when he was doing a portrait and he needed to place the highlight on the eye, he took his chalk pencil like this, just touched it to his tongue, and that seemed to lay down a kind of a more precise dot. And I found that to be really kind of helpful in areas like this. And I'm going to try to not overstate these, but thinking about generally where the highlights are, I'm not getting super caught up in whether they're 100% accurate. But I want these to feel really natural and scattered. Be careful of finding a rhythm where everything is spaced out evenly or where there's hard lines. You want dots and dashes, and you want that to feel organic and scattered, just like we're seeing here. On here, this is kind of nice where it starts to dip into shadow, but we're also getting some of these bright highlights that kind of catch those areas. And then I'm rolling the pencil to kind of give myself cleaner lines in some of those areas, using pressure. Trying to keep these marks really kind of organic looking. How does that look? And is that feeling like it's working Kind of soften this up a little bit. Now, it's the sharpness of the highlights that really suggest how smooth the surface is. So in this case, it's a freshly cut lemon, so that's really smooth. You got that surface layer of that lemon juice, and that's creating those sharp highlights. And you look over here, and the surface is smooth, but it's also pitted. So you get these really kind of sharp kind of points and dots. You come over here to this kind of fleshy part of the lemon. And I apologize for using that term. As I said it, it kind of grossed me out. So I hope it didn't as well for you. But as you go to this softer part of the lemon, it's just a subtle transition. There's no sharp highlight there, and that's what creates the impression of the awareness of the surface texture is how the light is reflecting off that, how sharp the highlights are, and the same with the shadows. So let me see, that's feeling pretty good. Some round marks to kind of soften that. Maybe kind of sharpen up this line a little bit. And that's feeling pretty good. All right, here we go. Actually, no, I'm going to move now into the light under here, which is attractive to me. Creating that light and dark pattern. That same kind of feathering technique, paying attention to the weight of the pencil. And this is where we can start to, you see there's that kind of reflected orange in that shadow. Start to define that, bring this light in under here, and let the two tones of the charcoal and the chalk mix together to create a contrast between slightly warmer, slightly cooler, and maybe even over here we can do that. So this is it's a really light touch on the paper that I'm using, and ultimately I'm just kind of using the white chalk as a blending tool more than anything. It's somewhat lightening the value, but it's not very, very heavy at all. Just kind of blending those two together. All right, you are welcome, and thank you all for joining me today. And we're going to keep going here. Not quite done, but I'm getting close to it. So I really appreciate you all taking the time to do this. I hope everybody's having a wonderful day. I don't know what it is, but I'm resisting going to this highlight here, but I'm just going to do it right now. Okay, I'm going to come back to that bounce light as I just thought of it as my eyes passed across this. I'm going to start building up this area, and you can see it's more dense in this central part here, kind of radiates out. You can start to see this kind of, this kind of radiating form, these concentric rings that form around the highlight. Kind of let that marks kind of skip across the surface in that. This isn't about kind of filling in that whole area. It's observing where they're more densely packed and where they're more diffused. I'm rolling my pencil all the time, using the side of it at this point still. And really just kind of reacting to the forms as I see them. So a lot of what's happening is I'm actually looking at the reference photo right here in front of me, and I'm keeping my awareness on the kind of the periphery of what my drawing hand is actually doing, and I'm just trying to react to those forms. And when I'm looking at the paper, I'm ultimately assessing the placement of the marks. Am I in the right spot? I just don't want to be working on highlights over on this area. But in terms of the shape of the marks, I'm letting my hand just kind of do its thing. Again, focusing on what I'm observing and letting those thoughts transfer into the pencil. I'm going to sharpen up this just a little bit. Kind of pushing and dragging. Looking for these highlights as we move out to the outer edges, then we just get these little dots of highlight. that we can replicate. Here we go. So hopefully you're all either following along, setting up your own still life, just drawing in general. I just find it so valuable to spend part of my day just locked in focus here and kind of bring me into this kind of present moment. You know, it's kind of like that feeling like when you go to a movie and you come back out and you don't even know what day it is because you've been so engrossed in that experience. And drawing kind of has that, and it can be rather intoxicating. All right, I'm feeling pretty good about that. I still want to bring this up a little bit. Officially lightening this area. I want to be careful not to create a line there that's too hard. So if you're working in graphite, if you have a pencil or just working on white paper, this might be an area that you erase out, make it a little bit sharper than it actually is. How do we feel about that? All right, thank you. Hello, folks. Reflected light in here. I'm going to use this chalk pencil here to create some of this texture. This becomes the focal point. This is where really all the detail is. And so by the eye coming in here, it's going to pass over this area of high detail here as well. And so I kind of want to provide a kind of transition area. And one of the things that you want to really understand about the objects in front of you is not necessarily really matching the marks mark from mark. Thinking about what happens to the marks as they move around the surface. So if I look over here, for example, the highlights here are a bit more open. They're really kind of round dots. As I move up into here, into this reflected light, everything gets squished as we're wrapping around that surface. And so rather than necessarily getting every mark exactly the way it is, I don't want my marks to replicate that feeling of the marks being more open here. And I can even push that by making these kind of round marks here. Being more open here, wrapping around, and then just getting these squished kind of marks, these thin kind of lines that will then create that impression that is wrapping around. If I made big open marks along here, again, it would flatten out that depth. It would kind of work against me. Smoothing things out a little bit. There's a little kind of reflected light in here that I find interesting here. I don't know if I did not get this form quite right, but that's all right. I need to bring this out, and actually this reflection comes up in here. I need to ask myself, is it worth it? Does it still read all right? I think it does. So as I mentioned earlier, with Artist Network, if you want to check out the show page on artistnetwork.com, there's more resources there. We really want to provide resources for artists no matter what level you're at, where you're at in your process, what you're looking for, whether you're just looking to have fun, whether you're looking to take things to the next level. We've got some stuff for you there. Whatever gets you working is what we're up, what we're up for. So check those out. Artist Network TV. That's a lot of what I work with, which is creating instructional videos for people. Check those out. We've got deals going on there. You'll find information if you want. But the main thing is just make art as much as you can. Figure out what you need. Find the resources that work for you. Try things out. And go from there. So thank you all for joining me. I'm feeling like this is pretty good. I'm going to kind of keep working maybe a little bit. There's some reflected light that I'm seeing down here that I've kind of neglected. It's using the charcoal on the side of my hand to kind of smudge that in. And I can start to kind of create this reflected highlight there. Yeah, but I'm feeling pretty good about this. Checking the show notes for the next one that's coming up. I just spaced on what it actually is. But I'm really looking forward to these as we go along. I'm just finding objects around the house, and I encourage you to do the same thing. A lot of us we're kind of asked to stay indoors, so we're doing that. Find out what you've got around you. It can all be interesting, and it can all be really helpful tools for you to grow your work. So again, thank you for joining me. I look forward to seeing you again, same time, 3 p.m. Eastern. I'm in Mountain Time, so 1 p.m. My time. Every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we've got a new drawing, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you there. So thank you. Keep drawing, and like I said, I may work on this for a little bit more, let this run, but I may just kind of sit quietly and work. Thank you, everybody. Seeing some good comments there. Thank you. I'm hoping we can find a way that we can all share the drawings that you're working on as well. So. That's about all I can do. All right. See you, everybody. Thank you.